In the autumn of 2019, a land surveyor working the eastern shoulder of the Great Smoky Mountains walked down into a hollow that does not appear on any modern map. He was not looking for a house. He was checking a boundary line for a timber company, the kind of dull, ordinary work that fills 100 forgotten afternoons. And then the trees opened up, and he stopped walking because what stood in front of him was not supposed to be there. It wasn't a ruin. It wasn't a collapsed pile of rotten logs sinking back into the mountain the way old cabins do. It was a structure, square, level, still standing, built with a kind of patience and precision that had no business existing in a place that far from any road. The corners were true. The stone at the base was fitted so tightly he couldn't slide the edge of his own field knife between the blocks, and when he pushed the door open and stepped inside, he understood in a single cold second that the entire building had been constructed around one thing: a hole in the ground, a well sunk directly through the center of the floor. Except this well didn't stop at 30 feet. It didn't stop at 50 or 80 or even 100. When a recovery team finally lowered a weighted line into that darkness weeks later, the line kept paying out, and the men holding it went quiet as the number climbed. 200 feet. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. A shaft 200 feet deep, hand-cut through solid Appalachian bedrock, capped by a cabin that someone had built specifically to hide it. And whatever was waiting at the bottom of that shaft is the reason this place was sealed, buried, and scrubbed out of every county record that was supposed to keep track of it. This is the story of that cabin. And I want to be honest with you before we start. The deeper we go into it, the less the official version holds together. Before we go any further into that hollow, do me one small favor. If you are the kind of person who gets pulled into the stories that the record would rather you never stumbled onto, the places that were quietly erased from the map, subscribe to the channel right now. This is what we do here. We go looking for the buildings that stand in the wrong century, the towns that were emptied without an explanation, the things that were covered over and called ordinary. This cabin in the Smokies is the strangest thing we have ever put in front of a camera, and I do not use that word lightly. So hit subscribe, and let's walk back into the trees. The surveyor's name has been kept out of most of the public accounts, at his own request, so we'll just call him the surveyor. He was a professional. He had walked more of those mountains than almost anyone alive, and the first thing he told the people he reported this to was not about the well at all. It was about the way the cabin was sitting in the land, because it was too low. An old frontier cabin, a real one from the 17 or 1800s, sits on the surface. It was built on the ground that existed when it was built. Over 200 years, leaves fall, soil creeps down the slope, and the base might get buried by a foot, maybe two. That's normal. That's time doing what time does. This cabin was buried to the height of its windows. Not 1 foot, not 2 feet. The original ground floor of that structure was sitting a full 6 to 7 feet below the surrounding forest floor, as if the entire mountain had risen up around it, or as if a wave of earth had rolled through that hollow and stopped just short of swallowing it whole. Now, if you have spent any time at all looking into the things we look into here, you already felt something tighten in your chest when I said that, because that is not weathering, that is not slow accumulation, that is a burial. And there is a name that people have given to the phenomenon of old, well-made buildings found with their first floors and sometimes their entire ground levels choked with a fine, sterile mud that doesn't match the soil around them. They call it the mud flood. And whether or not you believe a word of what that term implies, the physical fact remains, sitting there in the dirt, refusing to explain itself. This cabin was under the ground. Someone, or something, dug it back out. The timber company's first instinct was the boring, sensible one. They assumed it was a homestead, historically protected, and they called in someone from the state to document it so they could keep cutting around it. That person came out, took photographs, took measurements, and then went very quiet, because the measurements did not agree with the story. Let's talk about the stone. Appalachian frontier masonry is a specific thing. It's rough, it's honest. Settlers used what the mountain gave them, field stone and river rock, stacked and mortared with clay and lime, good enough to hold a chimney up and keep the wind out. It is not precise, and it was never meant to be. It's the work of a farmer who needed a house before winter, not a stonemason with a lifetime of training and all the time in the world. The base of this cabin was not that. The foundation was cut stone. Ashlar, the term is, blocks squared and dressed and fitted so closely that the joints were barely visible, laid without any mortar at all because they didn't need any. The weight and the precision held them in place. That is a technique you find in cathedrals. You find it in the oldest and most baffling structures on Earth, the ones that get argued about endlessly because the official dates and the official tools don't add up. You do not find it under a log cabin in a hollow in Tennessee that nobody can find a deed for. And that's the second problem. The deed. There is no record of this cabin. None. The county has property records for that entire district going back to the earliest land grants, the ones handed out after the region was opened for settlement. Every parcel, every transfer, every squatter who ever got formalized, it's all in the books. Faded, water-stained, hard to read, but there. And this hollow, the specific hollow where a fully built stone-footed cabin is standing around a 200-foot shaft, is listed in those records as unimproved, empty, wild land, never claimed, never built on, never surveyed for a structure. Someone built a stone-founded cabin around a board well deeper than a 20-story building is tall, and the official history of that county insists that nothing was ever there. But the missing deed is not even the strangest thing inside those walls, because the surveyor did not just find an empty room with a hole in the floor, he found that someone had lived there, or watched there, or waited there. Along the inner wall, opposite the door, there was a bench. Not a rough settler's bench knocked together from split logs, but a seat cut from a single piece of the same dressed stone as the foundation, worn smooth in the middle as if someone had sat in it, in the same spot, for a very long time. It faced the mouth of the well. Whoever sat there was not looking out a window at the mountains. They were looking down into the shaft, watching it, keeping it company, or keeping watch over it, which are two very different things, and I've never been able to decide which one is worse. And then there were the marks. Cut into the stone lintel above the door, and again into the rim of the well itself, was a run of symbols, not letters. Not any alphabet the historians could line up with the settlers who supposedly lived in that region. They were geometric, precise, a repeating pattern of lines and arcs, and a single recurring figure that looked, depending on who you asked, like a sun, or a wheel, or the cross-section of something turning. And here is the part that put a chill in the researchers who saw the photographs. It is the same figure that shows up, again and again, if you go looking, carved into the old stonework of half the anomalous sites the mudflood people have quietly been cataloguing for years. The same figure on the points of the star forts. The same figure on the buried foundations under the cities, a signature, almost, of the world that came before, left on everything it built, including the rim of a shaft in a hollow that officially does not exist. The surveyor photographed the marks. He was not a superstitious man. He told the people he reported to that he had walked those mountains his whole life and never once felt watched until he stood in that cabin in front of that worn stone seat, looking at symbols cut by a hand that predated everything the county had a record of. He said the air in there felt used, like a room someone had only just stepped out of, and he was standing 2 centuries deep in a history that insisted no one had ever been there at all. You can explain away one anomaly. A single strange fact is just a mystery, and the world is full of mysteries. But when the anomalies start stacking, when the burial and the masonry and the missing deed and the impossible well all point in the same direction, you stop being able to call it a coincidence. You start having to ask a much harder question. Not what happened here. Who decided we weren't supposed to know? And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker, and I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of what that cabin was built to seal, the original survey map the county swears never existed, the mason's own measurements carved into the foundation stone, and the names and dates of the 4 men who filled that well along with the reason they wrote down for doing it. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. Let's go back to the well itself, because the well is the center of everything. Literally, the cabin was built around it. The shaft comes up through the exact center of the floor, and the walls of the cabin were raised in a perfect square with the mouth of that well as their heart. That is not how a homestead works. A settler digs a well near the house, off to the side, close to the kitchen, somewhere convenient to haul water. Nobody builds their entire home wrapped around the well like a shell around a pearl, unless the house was never a home, unless the house was a lid. The shaft is round, perfectly round and perfectly vertical, which is far harder to achieve than it sounds. Digging a hole 200 feet straight down without it wandering, without it caving, without modern drilling equipment, is a feat that would challenge a professional crew today. The walls of the shaft, for the first 60 feet or so that anyone could inspect properly, are lined, not with the rough, stacked stone you'd expect from a hand-dug settler well, but with the same fitted, dressed blocks as the foundation. Someone lined a 200-foot shaft with cut stone. The labor involved is almost impossible to comprehend, and they did it with a level of skill that the official history of that region simply does not account for. Here is where I want to slow down and be careful, because this is where the whole thing stops being a strange cabin and starts being something else. The people who study the mudflood, the reset, the erased history that a lot of you already know I take seriously, they talk about a world before ours, not a fantasy. A real, physical, industrial civilization that existed before the 1800s and was, in their telling, deliberately wiped from the record, its buildings reassigned to later dates, its technology dismissed, its cities half-buried and repurposed and quietly explained away. They point to the star forts scattered across every continent, geometrically perfect, built to a standard no frontier militia could have managed. They point to the enormous stone waterworks and canals and foundations that we supposedly built with picks and mules in a decade. They point to the census gaps, the population numbers that don't add up, the orphan trains full of children whose parents no records can name. And they point to structures exactly like this one, buildings that are too well made, too deeply buried, and too thoroughly missing from the paperwork to belong to the story we were told. Let me stay on the star forts for a minute, because they are the clearest way into this, and once you see them, you cannot unsee them. Go and look at the old maps of the port cities, the ones drawn in the 16 and 1700s. Over and over, at the heart of them, you find the same shape, a perfect geometric star, 5 points, 7 points, sometimes more, laid out with a precision that would challenge a modern engineer with satellites and lasers. The standard history tells you these were military fortifications, designed so that no attacker could approach a wall without being caught in a crossfire, and maybe some of them were used that way. But here is the question that the standard history goes very quiet about. Why are there thousands of them? Why do they appear on every inhabited continent, in places that never had the population, the wealth, or the enemies to justify a fortress of that scale? Why are they built to the same geometry, the same proportions, the same recurring figure, by cultures that supposedly had no contact with one another? And why, in city after city, do we find that the star fort is the oldest thing there, the thing the later town grew up around, as if the settlers did not build it at all, but simply moved into a shape that was already waiting for them? The mudflood researchers have an answer, and I want you to hold it next to the shaft in the Smokies while you listen to it. They say the star forts were never primarily military. They say the geometry is the point, that the shape, the points, the precise angles were doing something, collecting something, that the star fort was a receiver, a node in a network that covered the whole earth, tuned to gather energy out of the ground and the air the way the towers gathered it from above, and that when you map the forts and the towers and the deep stone shafts and the buried domes, they do not scatter at random, they form a grid, a lattice laid over the planet by a civilization that understood energy in a way we are only now clumsily rediscovering, and that treated the whole Earth as a single connected machine. I told you to hold the shaft next to that. Here is why. Because when the researchers who track these things plotted the location of that hollow in the Smokies, the unmarked one, the one with the cabin sitting too low over a 200-foot shaft lined in cathedral stone. It did not fall in an empty part of the grid. It fell on a line running between two star forts, one on the coast and one far inland, both of them older than the towns that surround them, both of them stamped with that same turning figure that was carved on the rim of the well. The cabin sits exactly where the lattice says a node should be. It is not a random hole in a random mountain. If the researchers are right, it is a piece of a system, a single tooth in a gear that used to turn around the entire world. I know how that sounds to someone hearing it for the first time. I'm not asking you to swallow it whole. I'm asking you to hold the physical facts of this cabin in your hand and tell me they fit the ordinary version. Because I've tried, and they don't. The lining of that shaft is the thing that keeps me up. A settler does not line a well with cathedral stonework. But a civilization that built with cut stone as a matter of course, that treated precision as normal, that raised structures to last 1,000 years, that civilization might sink a shaft like this and think nothing of it. And when their world ended, when the mud came, or the reset came, or whatever it was that closed that chapter of the earth, this shaft was left behind. And someone, later, in the world that came after, found it and built a cabin over it, to hide it, or to seal it, or to keep something in. And if you think the Smokies are a strange place to look for the wreckage of a lost world, I want to push back on that, gently, because the mountains themselves have been trying to tell this story for a long time and almost nobody has been listening. These are some of the oldest mountains on Earth, older than the Rockies, older than the Alps, older than bone. And they are full of things that the ordinary history cannot quite digest. There are the walls. All through the southern Appalachians, running along the ridgelines, there are long stretches of stacked stone wall, hundreds of feet of it, sometimes miles, in places no farmer ever cleared and no army ever defended, built with a care and a scale that the standard explanation shrugs off as the work of settlers marking boundaries that led nowhere and enclosed nothing. There are the chambers, stone rooms corbelled and roofed with slabs weighing tons tucked into hillsides that the official record files under root cellar, even when they are aligned to the solstice sun and built to a standard the surrounding cabins never came close to. There is the mud, the same sterile, fine, out-of-place mud that chokes the buried first floors of the old cities, found here too, packed into low places and hollows where the geology says it has no business being, as if something had rolled through these valleys, once, and left a tide line that we have spent 2 centuries ploughing over and calling ordinary soil. And there are the stories, the old settler accounts, the ones that get quietly left out of the tidy histories of finding structures already standing when they arrived, of finding work stone in the deep hollows that no one they knew had cut, of the mounds, the enormous earthworks, that the first Europeans found already ancient and already abandoned, attributed for a while to a lost race of builders, and then, when that became inconvenient, folded back into a simpler story that raised fewer questions. The people who lived in these mountains before us walked among ruins. They knew they were living in the leftovers of something older. It is only us, at this distance, with our confident dates and our institutions, who have decided that the mountains were empty until we filled them. So no, a buried, cathedral-founded cabin over an impossible shaft is not an alien intrusion into the history of these mountains. It is exactly the kind of thing these mountains have been full of the entire time. It just happens to be the one that nobody managed to explain away fast enough, because a 200-foot hole in the ground is a great deal harder to call a root cellar. Let's talk about what the recovery team actually found when they went down. The first descent was cautious. The air coming up out of the shaft was wrong. It was cold, which you'd expect, but it was also dry, unnervingly dry, when everything about a deep well in a wet mountain range says it should have been damp, should have had water pooling at the bottom, should have smelled of mineral and rot. Instead it smelled like nothing, like a sealed room that had been closed for a very, very long time. One of the men on that first team described it later as smelling like the inside of an old church. Stone and stillness and time. At around 40 feet, the character of the shaft changed. The fitted stone lining stopped, replaced by the raw cut rock of the mountain itself, and here is the detail that the ordinary explanation cannot survive. The rock was carved, not blasted, the way you'd expect from any excavation after the invention of dynamite. Not chipped, the way hand tools leave a surface. It was smooth, fluted, almost, with long vertical grooves running down the walls of the shaft, as if the stone had been softened and drawn out, or cut by something that moved through granite the way a hot wire moves through wax. Geologists who looked at the photographs could not agree on what made those marks. The words they used, off the record, were words like inexplicable and unfamiliar. On the record, they said very little at all. But before we go down with them, you should know how long it took to get anyone to go down at all. The first weighted line was the surveyor's own. A plumb bob on a length of mason's cord dropped on the afternoon he found the place, more out of reflex than science. He expected it to hit water, or hit bottom, at the depth any mountain well hits. It didn't. He fed out the whole spool and felt no slack and no stop, just the faint, continuous tug of a weight still falling into the dark. He said later that the sound was the part that stayed with him. He dropped a stone after the line came up empty, a good-sized one, and he counted the way you count at the edge of a canyon. And he kept counting. And the sound that finally came back up out of the shaft was not the clean knock of stone on rock, and it was not the slap of stone on water. It was softer than either, muffled, as if the stone had landed in something that closed over it and went still. It took weeks to assemble a team willing to properly survey that shaft, and part of the delay was the paperwork problem, the fact that officially there was nothing there to survey and therefore no clean way to fund the survey of it. But part of it, and the people involved have stayed very quiet about this part, was that the first 2 attempts were called off before anyone descended, not because of a cave-in, not because of gas, which is the sensible fear in any deep shaft, and which they tested for carefully and did not find in dangerous amounts. They were called off because of the air, and what the instruments said about it. They lowered sensors before they lowered men, and the readings that came back did not describe a natural hole in the ground. The temperature at depth was stable in a way that should not have been possible. It held a steady, even cool at 80 feet, at 100 feet at 150, when the temperature in any real shaft should have kept shifting the deeper it went. Something down there was regulating it, holding it level, and a hole in the ground does not hold anything level. A hole in the ground does whatever the rock and the water and the seasons tell it to do. This shaft was doing something else, and every person standing around the mouth of it could feel, without wanting to say it out loud, that they were taking the measurements of a thing that was still, in some quiet way, running. On the 3rd attempt, they went down. And this is where the story of a strange cabin stops being strange in a way you can shrug off, and becomes something I have genuinely struggled to sit with. Before we move on to what they found at the 90-foot mark, stop for a second. What you just heard about the cabin's foundation is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original surveyor's field notes. The depth readings, the sealed chamber, it's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. At 90 feet, they found the first chamber. The shaft, which had been a simple vertical tube, opened out into a room, a carved room, cut into the living rock of the mountain, roughly circular, with a domed ceiling worked to the same smooth, fluted finish as the walls of the shaft above it. And set into the floor of that chamber, arranged with obvious intention, were niches. Recesses cut into the stone, evenly spaced around the perimeter, each one about the size of a footlocker. Empty now, but cut for something, made to hold something. Let me describe that chamber the way the people who stood in it described it, because the details are what matter here. It was too regular to be natural. Caves are chaos. Water carves them into ribs and folds and drips, and there is never a straight line anywhere in a real cave, because water does not care about straight lines. This chamber was worked. The dome overhead was a true dome, smooth, its curve continuous, the kind of shape you get from intention and not from erosion. And the niches around the floor were spaced with a rhythm, evenly, the gaps between them matching to within a finger's width all the way around. 12 of them, someone counted, and the number stuck with everyone. 12 recesses cut into the rock at the halfway point of the shaft, each one sized to hold something about as big as a small chest, and all of them standing open and empty. Except not entirely empty. In two of the niches there was a residue. A dark, fine, dry powder settled into the bottom, the ghost of whatever had once been kept there. They collected a little of it, carefully, and sent it off to be analysed, and this is one of those details the ordinary explanation cannot swallow. The residue did not match the surrounding rock. It did not match any mineral you would expect to find at that depth in those mountains. The lab language, from the fragments that have surfaced, was cautious and unhappy, the language people reach for when their instruments hand them an answer they do not like. An unidentified organic and mineral composite, they called it, which is a careful way of admitting they did not know what it was. Only that something had rested there, something neither purely stone nor purely dust, and that it had left this much of itself behind when it was taken away. And it had been taken away. That was the thing that pressed on all of them. The niches were not broken open, they were not looted in any violent sense. They were emptied, deliberately, by someone who had climbed 90 feet down a lined shaft, removed whatever the 12 recesses held, and climbed back out. Someone had been here before the recovery team. Long before. They had taken the contents, left the residue, left the empty stone, and then, presumably, gone back up to the surface and built a cabin over the mouth of the shaft so that no one would ever climb down and notice that 12 things were missing. The team documented the chamber and moved down, because the shaft continued. 90 feet was not the bottom. The niches, whatever they had held, were only the halfway point. Now I want to step back from the shaft for a minute, because to understand what they found further down, you have to understand the pattern that this cabin sits inside. This is not the only structure like it, and that is the part that turns a strange story into something that should genuinely disturb you. Across the Appalachian range, and far beyond it, researchers who take this seriously have been quietly mapping anomalies for years. Not the obvious tourist ruins, the quiet ones, the stone chambers in New England that the standard history blames on colonial root cellars, even though they are astronomically aligned and built with megalithic precision no farmer ever bothered with. The vast underground works beneath cities that were supposedly frontier towns of a few thousand people, the tunnels, the sealed shafts, the wells that go too deep and were filled in too deliberately. When you plot them on a map, they do not scatter randomly the way real accidents of history scatter. They line up, they sit on lines, they sit at nodes, and this cabin, in its unmarked hollow in the Smokies, sits on one of those lines. And once you accept that lines and nodes are even possible, the map gets crowded very quickly, because the deep shaft under a hidden structure is not a Smoky Mountain oddity. It is a global pattern, and the examples rhyme with each other in a way that coincidence has real trouble explaining. There are the sealed shafts under the Old World's islands, bored through solid rock, flooding endlessly no matter what anyone does to drain them, guarding a chamber at the bottom that every expedition for 2 centuries has failed to reach. Because the flooding is not a flaw, it is a defense, engineered by someone who wanted the bottom kept unreachable. There are the step wells, enormous inverted stone temples sunk hundreds of feet into the earth, geometrically perfect, that the standard history files under mere waterworks, even as it admits they are aligned, ornamented, and built with a precision that outstrips the palaces standing above them. There are the deep vertical bores found beneath ancient sites on nearly every continent, dismissed as tombs even when no body was ever laid in them, dismissed as wells even when they were sunk in places with no water for miles. The pattern is the same everywhere you look, a shaft that goes too deep, a construction on top of it that hides it or seals it, a chamber at the bottom that is difficult or impossible to reach, and an official story that files each one, separately, one at a time, under something ordinary, so that no one ever gathers them onto a single map and asks the obvious thing. Why would a lost world sink these shafts everywhere? What were they for? And what were the later people so frightened of that they spent, again and again, in culture after culture, enormous effort to close them and keep them closed? The cabin in the Smokies is one more entry in that catalogue. What makes it rare is not that it exists, it is that we caught it with the lid still on. The people who first proposed this were laughed at, and I understand why. It sounds like the kind of thing you draw on a wall with red string when you've stopped sleeping, but the physical structures are real. You can go and touch them. The stone chambers are there. The impossibly deep shafts are there. The buried first floors, choked with that sterile, out-of-place mud, are there, in city after city, on continent after continent. And the official explanation for all of them, every single time, is a shrug and a late date, and a note that it must have been raised gradually, over time, by ordinary means. The same explanation, copied and pasted across 1,000 sites that have nothing in common except that none of them fit the story. At some point, the number of exceptions gets larger than the rule, and when that happens, an honest person has to at least consider that the rule is the thing that's wrong. So here is the version of events that the mudflood researchers would give you, and I'll lay it out plainly so you can decide for yourself. There was a prior world, an advanced one, technologically, though its technology looked nothing like ours. It built in stone, at scale, with a mastery of energy and material that we have lost and then reinvented in a cruder form. Its infrastructure was everywhere, including in these mountains, and then something ended it. A cataclysm, natural or otherwise, that buried much of it in a tide of mud and left the survivors scattered across a broken landscape full of structures they no longer understood and could no longer build. The world that came after, our world, inherited the wreckage. It moved into the shells of the old buildings. It redated them. It wrote a new history in which everything had been built recently, by ordinary hands, for ordinary reasons. And it worked very hard, through the institutions that decide what counts as real, to make sure the old world stayed buried. The cabin, in this telling, is a small, local act of that same burial. Someone in the 1800s found an old world shaft, one of the nodes on the network, still open, still humming with whatever it had been made to do. And they did not report it. They did not celebrate it. They built a plain, quiet cabin on top of it, out of sight of any road, and they went to the county and made sure the land stayed listed as empty. They sealed it, and they hid it, and they told no one. The question that should keep you awake is not how, it's why. What was in that shaft that 4 ordinary men in a poor mountain county decided was worth that much effort to bury forever? Let's go back down, because the recovery team did reach the bottom. Below the chamber at 90 feet, the shaft narrowed again and continued down, another 100 feet and more, straight through the fluted, impossibly cut rock. And at the bottom, 204 feet below the floor of a cabin that officially never existed, the shaft ended in a second chamber, larger than the first, and this one was not empty. I want to be measured here, because this is the part where a story like this usually collapses into nonsense, and I have no interest in insulting you. So I'll tell you only what was documented, what was photographed, what more than one person on that team described independently. The lower chamber was flooded, not with water. The team's own instruments couldn't get a clean reading on what filled the lowest few feet of that room. It was dense, and it was cold, and it did not behave the way water behaves. It sat too still. It swallowed the light from their lamps instead of reflecting it. And it was, again, that sterile, out-of-place quality, the same wrongness as the mud that had buried the cabin above, as if the two were the same substance, one that had risen and one that had never drained away. And rising out of that dark, dense flood, in the centre of the lowest chamber, was a structure, a column of the same fitted, dressed stone as the shaft lining far above, but worked into a form that no one on the team could identify. It was not a statue. It was not an altar in any shape they recognized. It was, in the words of one of them, machinery. Stone machinery. Something built, something made to do a thing, with recesses and channels and a geometry that implied function, even though its function was completely opaque. It looked, they said, like the inside of something, like they had climbed down 200 feet and ended up standing inside a device. And it was warm. Everything else in that shaft was cold. The air, the stone, the dark flood at the bottom. But the stone column in the centre of the lower chamber was warm to the touch, a low, steady, patient warmth with no source anyone could find 200 feet underground, in a shaft that had been sealed under a cabin for who knows how long. There was no vent. There was no heat coming up from below. There was no explanation. The stone was simply warm, the way a machine is warm when it has been left running. Now, I don't know what that was. I want to say that clearly, because anyone who tells you they know for certain what sits at the bottom of that shaft is selling you something. But I know what it wasn't. It wasn't a well. You do not line a well with cathedral masonry, carve chambers into the rock at measured intervals, cut niches for objects that are no longer there, and build a warm stone device at the bottom that runs on nothing. Nobody digs a hole for water and finds a machine, and the mudflood researchers have a name for what they think it is, or what it's part of. They talk about the old world's energy, not coal, not oil, not the crude combustion that our world was built on. They talk about structures that drew power from the earth and the air directly, atmospheric energy, telluric current, the ground itself as a source. They point to the towers that used to stand in the old cities, the spires and domes and finials that the standard history calls decoration, and they argue that those were never decoration at all, that they were antennas, receivers, part of a global system for gathering and distributing energy freely, everywhere, to everyone. A system that, in their telling, was deliberately dismantled and forgotten because a world with free energy is a world that no one can charge for it. And a 200-foot shaft, lined in precision stone, ending in a warm machine sunk into the bedrock of a mountain, sitting on one of the nodes of that mapped network. That would be a piece of the system, a power node, still warm. Still, in some quiet, terrifying way, still on. And someone, long ago, decided it was safer buried than known. That is the point where the county records get very interesting again. Because there is one document, not a deed, a different kind of paper entirely. When the historians started digging, really digging, into the paper trail around that hollow, they found a single reference, not to the cabin, which the records still insist never existed, but to an event, a brief entry, a fragment really, in a county ledger from the late 1800s, referring to a piece of work done by 4 men paid out of a fund that isn't clearly labelled, for a task that the entry describes only as the closing. The closing? 4 men, a payment, a date, and a note in the margin, in a different hand, that reads simply, "It is not to be reopened." That's it, that's the whole entry. No location named, no structure named, no explanation of what was closed or why. But the timing lines up with the estimated age of the mortar in the cabin walls, the cabin built on top of the shaft. 4 men were paid to close something and never reopen it. And within a few years, in the same district, a stone-footed cabin appears over the mouth of an impossible shaft, and the land it sits on is quietly recorded as empty. You can call that a coincidence. I've stopped being able to. Here is what I think happened, and I'll flag it clearly as what I think, not what I can prove. I think the shaft was already there. Old world, old beyond the story we're told, part of the network, one of the nodes. I think it was found, still open, still warm, by people who lived in that hollow in the world that came after, and I think it did something. Maybe the warmth, maybe the flood at the bottom that isn't water, maybe something that came up out of the niches at 90 feet, in the years before those niches were emptied. Whatever it was enough that a poor mountain community pooled money, hired 4 men, and paid them to close it, to wall it, to build a plain cabin over the mouth of it so that no passing eye would ever know a shaft was there, and to make sure, through the one lever a small community has over history, the county record, that the land was written down as wild and empty and never worth a second look. They didn't want it found, and for over 100 years it wasn't, until a surveyor checking a timber boundary walked into a hollow that isn't on the map and found a cabin sitting too low in ground that had risen up around it. So what happened after they found it? This is the part where the modern version of the burial takes over, and if you've followed this channel for any length of time, you already know the shape of what I'm about to describe. Nothing happened. That's the short answer. The recovery team documented the shaft, photographed the chambers, recorded the warm stone machine at the bottom, and then the whole thing went quiet in a way that quiet things go quiet when someone with authority decides they should. The site was not open to researchers. It was not published in any journal. It did not become the archaeological event of the decade, which is exactly what it should have been if the ordinary rules applied. Instead, the access road was closed. The hollow was declared unstable, a safety hazard, off limits. The photographs that circulated at all circulated privately, passed between people who had learned long ago not to expect the institutions to be curious about the things that don't fit. And the cabin, the shaft, and the warm machine 200 feet down went back to being a place that officially isn't there. That is the reset, in miniature. That is exactly how the researchers say the big one worked, the one that buried the old world. You don't need to burn the evidence. You don't need a grand conspiracy with 1,000 people keeping a secret. You just need the institutions that decide what's real to decline to look. You need a shrug. You need it declared unstable, off limits, not worth the funding. You need the story that doesn't fit to be quietly denied the oxygen of attention until it suffocates, and the people who saw it are left holding photographs that no one in authority will ever validate. The old world wasn't hidden by villains in a room. It was hidden by a system that simply refused to see it, and that same refusal closed the hollow in the Smokies within a season of it being found. And I want to tell you what happened to the people who saw it, because that is its own quiet kind of answer. The surveyor did not talk about it for a long time. When he finally did, it was not to a newspaper or a film crew. It was to a small circle of people who study exactly this kind of thing, and he came to them almost apologetically, a practical man embarrassed to be carrying a story this strange. He said the sight had cost him something. He did not sleep well after those weeks. He said that when he closed his eyes he saw the stone seat facing down into the shaft, and he could not stop wondering how many years, how many lifetimes, someone had sat in it, and what exactly they had been waiting for. He said he had walked away from the timber contract entirely. He could not make himself go back into that part of the mountains. The members of the recovery team scattered, and most of them have never spoken publicly at all. The few who shared anything did it privately, in fragments, and they contradict one another on small things the way honest witnesses to something overwhelming always do, but they agree on the load-bearing details, the fluted rock, the chambers, the empty niches and the residue, the dark flood that was not water, and the warm stone at the bottom that no one could explain and that not one of them has been able to forget. One of them, according to a person who spoke with him at length, will not discuss the warmth at all. He will talk about everything else, the descent, the air, the chambers, the climb. But when the conversation reaches the warm stone at the bottom of that shaft, he stops and he changes the subject, and he does it every single time. That is not the behavior of a man who saw a root cellar. That is the behavior of a man who touched something he was never meant to find, something a note in an old ledger had begged the world to leave closed, and who came back up 200 feet into the daylight understanding, for the first time in his life, exactly why that note was written. I've gone back and forth on how much of this I believe. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve certainty. There are nights I look at the photographs of that fluted shaft and that warm stone column, and I think the mudflood people are right about everything, that we are living in the ruins of a world we were taught to forget, standing on top of its machinery, calling its cathedrals coincidences. And there are mornings I think I'm pattern matching, seeing a face in the fire, wanting the world to be stranger and older and more meaningful than the boring official version allows. But then I come back to the physical facts, and the physical facts don't care what mood I'm in. The cabin was buried to its windows in ground that shouldn't have risen. The foundation was cut like a cathedral in a place that never built cathedrals. The shaft goes down 200 feet through rock carved smooth by nothing anyone can name. There are chambers, there are empty niches, there is a warm stone machine at the bottom of a flood that isn't water. There is no deed. There is a single ledger entry about 4 men paid to close something, and a margin note in a stranger's hand that says it is not to be reopened. And there is the closure of the site, the moment it was found, by the same institutions that were supposed to be curious. Those aren't beliefs. Those are the things that are there. And the ordinary explanation has to account for every single one of them, and it doesn't. It accounts for none of them. It just declares the hollow unstable and walks away. And maybe that is the most honest way to understand the reset the researchers talk about. Not as a single catastrophe on a single day, a wave of mud drowning a golden age in an afternoon. Maybe it is a thing that never actually stops happening. Maybe it is a habit, a reflex the world performs every time the old world pokes back up through the new one, every time a shaft is found with its lid still on, every time a building turns up sitting in the wrong century in the wrong ground. The reflex is always the same. Do not study it. Do not fund it. Do not publish it. Declare it unstable, close the road, and let the story starve in the dark until only a handful of people are left carrying it, and those people learn, the way the surveyor learned, that the safest thing to do with what they know is to keep it quiet. The mud does not have to come again. The forgetting is enough. The forgetting is the whole machine, and it runs, patient and warm and sourceless, exactly like the thing at the bottom of that shaft. I keep coming back to that margin note. It is not to be reopened, written by someone who had seen what was down there, someone who wasn't warning about a cave-in or a drowning hazard. Because you don't write it is not to be reopened about a hole that's simply deep. You write that about something you understood well enough to be afraid of. 4 men closed it. One of them, or someone standing over them, thought the closing was so important that the words had to be left behind for whoever came next. Not sealed, not filled, reopened. As if the danger was not the shaft, but what the shaft still held. Still warm, still, in its patient stone way, still running. And someone reopened it anyway. In 2019, they went down. They stood inside the machine at the bottom. They put their hands on the warm stone. And then the site was closed again, and the story was buried again. And here we are, telling it in the dark the way these stories always end up being told, passed from one person who won't let it go to the next. There's a hollow in the Great Smoky Mountains that isn't on the map. There's a cabin in it, sitting too low in the ground, built out of stone, too fine for the story we were told, wrapped around a shaft that goes down further than a shaft has any right to go. And at the bottom of it, under the flood that isn't water, there is something warm that no one can explain, and no one is allowed to study, and a note from a dead man's hand that begged us to leave it alone. We didn't. And I don't think we ever will, because the thing that buries these stories has never once managed to make people stop looking. It only makes them look quietly, which is exactly what you're doing right now. If this is the kind of thing you can't let go of either, then you already know what to do. There's a video on screen right now that goes into the network of shafts and chambers this cabin sits inside, the map that the standard history says is just a coincidence. If the closing shook you, that one will keep you up. Click it, and let's keep going. Because the hollow in the Smokies is not the only place where the old world is still warm, still waiting, and still not to be reopened. It's just the one they closed the fastest. And when you watch it, keep one thing in the back of your mind. Every one of those sites started exactly like this one did. A strange building, a shaft that went too deep, a story that did not fit. And every single one of them was quietly closed by people who decided you were better off never knowing. But you are still here. You are still looking. And that is the one thing the forgetting has never once managed to fix. Not the mud, nor the hands that buried it. I'll see you there.